For some analysis, we are now joined in studio by journalist and author Max Blumenthal. Nice to see you, Max. All of this news came as Russia attempted to reassure Israel that Iranian forces are in fact pulling back from positions in the Golan. However, in an interview this week with Israeli media, Moscow's ambassador to Tel Aviv said of those groups, quote, "They are playing a very, very important role in our common and joint effort to eliminate terrorists in Syria. That is why, for this period of time, we see as non-realistic any demands to expel any foreign troops from the entirety of the Syrian Arab Republic." What has Israel's role in this fight been?
Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge that Iran and the Shia militias have pulled back 85 kilometers from the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights border. So they've pulled back their heavy weapons, and that was part of the agreement that seemed to have emerged from the Helsinki summit of Putin and Trump. Israel, however, is constantly trying to move the goalposts, and it's saying it's not satisfied with this. It wants a total removal of all Iranian and Iranian-backed forces from Syria, and so it's not satisfied with Russia and the UN forces moving back to provide these peacekeeping roles. And at the same time, what you hear from the Russian ambassador to Israel is that Iran is playing an indispensable role in the fight against ISIS, which is still present in Syria. And in fact, Israel just announced that it had to kill 6 ISIS militants who were attempting to approach Israeli-occupied territory. So Israel is in a real bind here. But what we're looking at is a stalemate. Israel gets a drawback of Iranian forces, Russia gets to play the adult in the room, and Iran gets to stay. We'll see where it goes.
And explain for viewers who might not know why the Golan is so central to tensions between Israel and Syria historically, and how that region has fit into the war in Syria the last few years.
Well, the Golan Heights were occupied by Israel in 1967. They were not returned in 73 as part of the Camp David Accords. Israel has moved civilian populations into the Golan Heights in violation of the Geneva Conventions and UN Resolution 242, which forbids that. And a lot of people don't know that before the Syrian conflict erupted in 2011, Israel and the government of Bashar al-Assad were engaged in high-level negotiations about the return of the Golan Heights or parts of it to Syria. This is something that Israel, and particularly Netanyahu, did not want. It seized on the Syrian conflict as an opportunity to kill those negotiations. Soon after the conflict erupted, al-Qaeda-linked forces abducted UN peacekeepers. The UN was removed. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Free Syrian Army moved in, and Israel began actually supporting these groups as it supported the South Lebanese Army in South Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War. And now with the removal of these troops, Israel faces what it considers an existential threat.
Well, Israel isn't only making news this week in Syria. On the other side of the country's undeclared borders this week, Tel Aviv announced it was going to reimpose a blockade of fuel deliveries to Gaza. I want to ask you more about that, but first let's turn to our reporter Dan Cohen, who filed this report.
Israeli and Egyptian-imposed fuel shortages have long limited Gaza's electricity supply to 3 to 4 hours per day. With the Israeli defense minister's order to shut down the crossing, 2 million Palestinians inside Gaza will be left with hardly any power at all.
This is a massive attack. I think we can safely call it a biological warfare, because it is calculated and intended to make life dangerous and deadly for 2 million people in Gaza, half of them children.
Lieberman cited the threat of so-called kite terrorism when he announced the closure on Wednesday. A statement from the Israeli Defense Ministry said, quote, "The decision has been taken in view of the continued terror of incendiary balloons and friction along the fence. For months, Palestinians have been sending incendiary kites across the fence that separates Gaza from Israel, some of which have started fires in agricultural lands. Abu Nima says it's a response to Israel's ongoing occupation and killing of unarmed protesters, journalists, medical personnel, and children."
This is a form of resistance that hasn't killed anyone, hasn't injured anyone, and certainly cannot be used as a pretext to inflict deliberate suffering on 1 million children in Gaza, as Israel is doing. That's a war crime.
On Friday, Israeli snipers killed 11-year-old Majdi Ramzi Kamal al-Satri and 16-year-old Momen Fathi Youssef al-Hams 150 others were injured, including journalist Zaki Yahya Awadallah, who was shot in the leg. That raises the death count to 155 since the Great March of Return began on March 30th, 23 of them children. Israel has also injured more than 17,000 people, according to Gaza's health ministry. During that period, a Palestinian sniper killed one Israeli soldier. Reporting in Washington, Dan Cohen, RT.
And Max, the latest numbers for the Great March of Return today have 220 Palestinians injured and one dead. What's preventing Gaza from all-out humanitarian collapse at this point?
Well, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's actually just canceled a trip to Colombia, which is actually interesting in its own right, in order to hammer out what his government says are long-term negotiations with Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, which are actually themselves being pushed by Egypt to carry out a long-term deal to allow for fuel supplies to re-enter Gaza. Yesterday, Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman announced the end of fuel supplies to Gaza. This is taking, as Ali Abunimah pointed out, a catastrophic situation and sending it into a humanitarian tailspin. I don't know if these negotiations are going to work out or not, but the background is the Great March of Return, which has thrown Israel's international image into the gutter because they've killed over 150 protesters, and these flaming kites, which are putting political pressure on Netanyahu from the southern communities dominated by the Israeli right wing, which are experiencing occasional fires. So Netanyahu has to somehow put out these fires. He wants to negotiate for a return of aid supplies, but the fact is that the humanitarian and infrastructure damage that's been done to the Gaza Strip over 10 years of hermetic siege might have made it so difficult to even begin to bring Gaza back to a baseline of adequate humanitarian situation. The UN has predicted that Gaza will be unlivable by 2020, and it appears we're well on the way towards experiencing that.
And some might say it's already quite unlivable. Author and journalist Max Blumenthal, thanks so much for your time this afternoon.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.